Welcome to the Re-Quilibrium podcast. I'm Danielle Lacourte, and this is a conversation with Francois Sauer, who is hard to sum up in a few sentences. He's a special advisor to the Sustainability and Health Initiative for Net Positive Enterprise at Harvard, or Harvard Shine. And over the past 30 years, Francois has served as CEO, executive advisor, and consultant to large enterprises like AT&T, as well as startups. Initially trained as a physician and having worked at the systems level with healthcare technologies, Francois is a true polymath, philosophical thinker, and beautiful mind. And in this conversation, we wrestle with the interplay of individuals and systems, how constraints are a real and often fruitful element of organic systems, and how data ecosystems are informing society at an unprecedented level. For more conversations like this, subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. All the show notes for each episode can be found on my website at daniellelacourte.com/podcast. That is DANIELLELECOURT.com/podcast. You can also follow me on Medium, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn at Danielle Lacourte. And again, since it's been a minute, you can catch up on legacy episodes of this podcast on all of these platforms as well. So now here's my conversation with Francois Sauer. Thanks, Francois. And, we always have such fascinating conversations, and I am really excited for this episode just to get back into it. But, I think that the weight of your wisdom and the weight of your perspective is really kind of grounded in your background. And so I'm wondering if you can take a second just to catch us all up on your background and the things that you've been able to accomplish.
Well, my background is very simple. I start as a medical doctor, and parallel to the medical doctor, I start also to be have a master degree in computer science. And then I was working for the Social Security, for the director of the Social Security in Mexico. And because I was the link between the Castelazo Ayala, who was at that time the director of Social Security, El Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social, with the presidency, I asked him to be able to have some basic understanding of business. So I did an MBA that was at that time the Harvard Business School program in Mexico. So that is my academic background, if you want.
Yeah, and something that I find really fascinating about your story too, and I think I've seen it play out just in your perspective in general and your general focus on health and well-being, along with, and the various facets that come with that. But your combination of your MD background plus your computer science background, I think has, at least in my experience, it's really allowed you to keep both the individual level and the systemic level in mind at all times. And I know we have a lot of these conversations about what actually goes into well-being for the individual, for societies, for groups. And I'm wondering, if I'm stretching too much by saying that, the MD kind of brought this focus on individual well-being, while the computer science kind of focused on systems. Is that too much of a stretch?
No, not at all. In fact, what is fascinating is that traditionally, when you think about the conventional training as an MD, is basically focused on disease, not human being. And on the other hand, and for me it was a privilege to have that training as an executive at MIT in system dynamic, you discover that we are most of the time looking at complex system, and therefore the linear thinking that is associated with, for example, solving a disease doesn't work. So this is when you, as you mentioned, accept the fact that to address well-being, we need a systemic thinking, not a linear thinking.
Right. Well, and I don't know about you, but it's something that I've noticed gaining purchase throughout my career at least is this, people are grabbing onto systems thinking and these systemic concepts that relate to things like well-being and flourishing, self-actualization, even flow states, all of these things that kind of circle around each other to build rich human life. It's nice to see people really kind of starting to adopt that systems thinking mindset. And I know you and I met via Stephen Kotler's group that deals a lot with flow and high performance and concepts like that that really are nourishing for the individual level. And I'm wondering I'm wondering how you see this play out of, these individual actions of accessing flow states, for example, or pursuing concepts like self-actualization. How do you see that playing out within this kind of systemic context?
Well, again, when we are speaking about a systemic context, we may speak about living organism. And the key challenge between a living organism versus a mechanical environment is that in a mechanical environment, the piece define the behavior of the tool. In a living organism, the purpose of that living organism define the living or the behavior of the piece. So it's exactly the opposite. And when we think about all what we were exposed to in terms of flow or in terms of well-being, we need to have a high level of humility to accept that we operate within an environment that creates constraints. So that when we want to do something, is not in a position that is free from constraint, but within constraints. And that makes a difference.
I love that you bring up the idea of constraints because a lot of the things I've been reading and listening to um, speak of this concept of constraint actually urging creativity or constraint being a necessary element to thinking in entirely different ways. And I'm wondering, those constraints, any system is going to have a set of constraints, right? And so how the interplay between those constraints and individual responses or responses of cultures or groups, it just seems like a really interesting area that's being focused on now.
Yes, well, there's no doubt about that constraint will stimulate our creativity. But at the same time, we need to accept that some of them are out of our control. So then it's having that humility and going back to the position, well, change what you can and accept what you are not able to change, uh, to acknowledge those limitations.
Right. I'm wondering if you can, and just to keep setting the stage of these concepts that we've been kicking around for a few years now, um, but I'm wondering if you can speak to how this interplay, between systems and individuals, and the introduction of constraints and the idea of well being, how that kind of played out. I think your story about the health system in Mexico, that basically you helped set up the nationalized healthcare system. Is that right?
Yes, well, I was responsible very early in the design of the healthcare system for the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social with Castelazo Ayala. And in that time, we use the reference of a hospital in Sweden, the Danderyd Hospital, to design the first healthcare information system for the social security.
Can you talk about what that looked like?
It was very simple, extremely simple. Basically, it was taking the basic emergence information that you need to treat a patient. So we are speaking about allergy, we are speaking about previous disease, and that's it. It was a very, very simple system at that time.
And how did that, I mean, how was that? How were you thinking about it at the time? And I mean, reflecting back now, what were the lines of thought that you put into that system similar to the ones that you wrestle with now, or how was that really kind of playing out in context of the time?
Well, again, at that time, it was only to have access to previous information real time for patient. So it was just to give a context to have the opportunity to better treat a patient. Today, information system in the healthcare environment are going much further to harvest the information accumulated to have better therapy. So it's not only to obtain the context, but also to extract information from that context for better therapies.
Right. Well, and I wanted to bring up that example because, and this is something I see out or see play out in my work as well, because basically now my work, um, I work on topics related to healthcare and medicine, as well as education and education policy, and where these two concepts meet in my work is in that of data science. And I always find it really interesting to kind of track the progress of basically what you're describing as a data set and a data system for being able to access and therefore act upon and make decisions upon a data set, and to see kind of the progression of, how the data ecosystem, the data organism that drives so many fields today has really evolved and is informing us on a level that we've never seen.
Absolutely. Well, in fact, we have an incredible opportunity now to harvest the accumulated experience uh, in those systems. And the key question is that most of the time, uh, data scientists need an executive mindset to be able to define the adequate questions because the data is there, but the extraction of knowledge and wisdom from those data is predicated on the quality of the questions.
Mm. It's fascinating that you bring that up, and I'm really glad that you picked up on that too, because working with anybody who works with big data sets, I heard somebody say the line last week that the results of this algorithm or this test that we get are a result of decisions that we make at the outset, at the beginning of it. And I love that you are talking about it now, but you have always talked about basically the ethics of the decisions that go into working within the data ecosystem and the human ecosystems that we are working in now. And I think that's maybe what you're getting at with executive mindset. Is that right?
Yes, well, again, the challenge when you introduce the concept of ethics is that is not an absolute context, is a relative context to a specific community. So at the end of the day, ethics are to create the cohesion within a specific community of human beings. And therefore, we need to be careful about acknowledging the fact that each community may have a different ethic.
Well, so how do you, I mean, as we're all, and obviously, conditions are even more constrained and different now during the pandemic. But how do you, when speaking about, you have to be careful about the framework for ethical thinking. Can you say more about that? I mean, how do people start to tease out these contextual questions about what is the right thing to do and what are the right decisions to make?
Well, again, when we are speaking about the right thing to do, we are making a reference to, on one hand, a specific objective, because you want to do something to achieve something. On one hand, in the context of what is the value for the community. And again, it's becoming each day more difficult because our community are expanding and therefore increasing in diversity. So if you have a very small community, uh, the homogeneity of that community is simple. But if you have a very large community, its diversity makes very difficult to have shared values.
And is this where the executive mindset that you talked about comes in?
Yes, because at one point you need to make a decision.
Right.
What are the value that you propose to this community, uh, and find out if they accept it or not. So executive mindset doesn't mean autocratic mindset.
How are they different?
Well, in the sense that most of the time, and again, depending the level of development of our consciousness, we may believe in an autocratic system as a way to impose concept. And you have some countries that have that mindset, and they have the result that we know. On the other hand, in a democracy, you may want to have a self-managing environment, but that creates much more complexity because, on one hand, you want to honor the diversity of that community, and on the other hand, you need still to have some shared value for that community to have cohesion.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a good segue to the concept of work. And I was speaking to Eileen McNeely last week from Harvard Shine about this particular thing, and I think all of this background in our conversations has converged around work as a platform, and what we were discussing at the time as the work paradox, because it seems like work is one of those platforms where this is playing out the most for people, this meeting of the individual and the systemic, this entrance point for making decisions and having shared value in a diverse environment. Work, this fulfillment of individual needs as well as economic needs as well as systemic needs and organizational needs. It became this really interesting, just a really interesting platform for discussion of all where all of these different things that we're wrestling with meet.
Yes, and again, I admire the fact that you uh, create that concept of work paradox, and I know that Eileen enjoy it too. So the fact is that on one hand, we need to acknowledge that work from an autocratic perspective is destructive because the individual has no power. The individual is empowered. On the other hand, if we look at work as a platform for the individual to step into its power and therefore to manifest to the fullest its competence, then works become a wonderful stepstone for flourishing.
Right. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about this concept of competence and how that really plays into human flourishing?
Well, basically, you have multiple authors and so on, but I will just mention Frederic Laloux, and he has multiple books, but one we called Reinventing Organization, where he described beautifully the concept of self-management or self-managing organization. And again, the purpose of it is not that everyone has the same power, but that everyone is fully empowered. So some people may have a much bigger impact than others, depending on their roles, uh, but it doesn't mean that someone has less power to be who he or she wants to be.
Well, and I've always found this debate about this interesting, because I've heard multiple viewpoints about this when it comes to competence at work and how do you actually empower individuals um, to participate at a level that is both good for the organization and good for the individual. And this is where that interplay between the individual and the systemic really comes in, because this idea of competence, there's a belief out there that some people don't want to pursue that. Don't It's not of interest to them, and there's all these, people that can't be trusted to be empowered within an organization. That's kind of the cynical view of how this all plays out. But I think that, this idea of facilitating learning, for example, and facilitating these aspects of um, individual empowerment and self-actualization actually creates the conditions for humans that may have been written off by people who don't see the interplay between the system and the individual, as not interested. It creates the environment for the individual to flourish.
Yes, well, and again, I totally accept what you are saying in terms of we need to create an environment for the people to flourish. Now, is a shared commitment, is not an authority commitment. So if we want to create an environment because it's a shared commitment of all the participants to honor the participant of the other participant, then we have that situation. And the contrast with the hierarchical system is that you have a leader saying, this is what we want, instead of having a shared commitment between the participants in that specific community or work environment.
Right. So kind of this idea of co-creating, and as opposed to dictating.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I kind of want to back up a little bit, because I'm curious what you're thinking about now. As I've been saying to clients and to basically, various people in my life, that there was the world before COVID and there's the world now. And some of the things that people were working on before the pandemic are no longer relevant. And, the way that we have worked has changed almost overnight. And when talking about these ideas of empowerment and flourishing, this might be a, a loaded question, but in your opinion, why do these questions matter? Why are we thinking in these terms of human flourishing, at this point in particular? Now that the world has changed, I mean, what has become acute about those considerations?
Well, again, this is only one point of view, and I'm by no means presupposing that is shared. The fact is that COVID maybe is an incredible opportunity to realize that the value of each individual today is in its brain, not in its hands. So, if we are speaking about an environment where the value of the work is in the brain of the person, not in the physical capacity of that human being, and COVID made that explicit through remote work, then you better have good access to that brain. And you will not have good access to that brain with coercive mode. Therefore, building an environment for the flourishing of the individual becomes a requisite for those individuals to cooperate.
Can you expand on what you mean by, I think you said corrosive mindset?
Coercive mindset,
Oh, coercive. Yeah, yeah.
coercive mindset means an autocratic mindset, a position where you will do what I say. And that works for many, many years. If you are to dig a hole, you can have the individual in front of you and he is not digging the hole. But when you are speaking about creativity, now you are speaking about the behavior of a brain, and there's no way to look at what's going on.
Well, and to play devil's advocate a little bit, because I think a lot of us are seeing this play out in the United States, but also around the world, that there is a facet of autocratic mechanisms of leadership that appeal to people and that work. And I'm curious your thoughts on, you know, I mean, my opinion is that these systems wouldn't exist if they didn't work and if they didn't offer something. And I'm curious what you see about, why these systems work and why there still continues to be an appetite for them.
Well, I totally accept that that works, and in fact, in many cases, they work beautifully
Hmm.
because
And efficiently.
I'm not so sure about efficiency, but effectiveness, yes. Uh, so that in practice, and we have that with different countries who are very autocratic, is no doubt about they achieve results and very good results. The challenge, and again, is not about achieving results, but about managing complex systems. And my presupposition is, and again, I'm perfectly capable of being wrong. My presupposition is that as the system is more complex, they become less efficient. They may be effective, but not efficient. So, therefore, they may create their own collapse. So, for me, at least, this is my value system. I strongly believe in democracy, although I accept that democracy is messy. And I accept that democracy has a lot of limitation because it's very difficult for human being to move from a position of dependence to a position of independence. And for years, our society was educated in a context of dependence. For years, our society was educated in systems that were hierarchical. So we are at a turning point in terms of civilization where we are moving in a way that we want to express ourselves in the context of a community that also has its own purpose. So the balancing of the individual versus the community is very messy.
Well, but I like what you're saying there too, because this idea of co-creating that direction forward, and really embracing diversity of thought within those systems. I mean, a hierarchical system um, leaves a lot out, and it leaves a lot of people out. And so, having a more having a mindset that more embraces this idea of context, I think allows in the long run greater agility in our decisions, right? Because we can actually respond to issues or challenges or nuance that's right in front of us that maybe a hierarchical system would miss.
Yes, I totally accept what you are saying because most of the time, when you are speaking about a hierarchical system, is a long distance between who is experiencing the problem and who is presupposed to solve it. So, as a consequence of that distance between the field of engagement where the problem is and the person presupposing having the competence to solve that problem, you have an incredible number of discontinuity and inefficiency.
Well, and I'm curious, and I kind of want to dig a little bit deeper on this because your introduction of yourself and your backstory was quite modest, and you've actually had quite a bit of experience at very high levels of leadership. And I think a lot of people can buy into the concept of yes, we need to do this, and I think get stuck on the okay, but how? And I'm wondering, if it was you and you were thinking through how do we actually operationalize this? How do we make this a workable system that is working, in service of diversity of thought and agility and creativity? How would you even approach that as a leader?
Well, basically, as you mentioned, is no blueprint. It is not one solution that fixes everyone. So, as a leader, you need to acknowledge the level of consciousness of your organization because not all organization has the same level of development of consciousness. Some may still be at a very primitive level of command and control. And for those organizations, the shift to an environment that is self-managed is a very complex change.
Well, and when you say the level of consciousness of the organization, what do you mean?
Well, I mean that many people are still operating from a mindset of hierarchical organization where what is significant is to be compliant to what the authority wants. What I mean is that still a lot of human beings may find their identity in their job instead of themselves. So to move from that hierarchical structure to a self-managing environment where you acknowledge that each human being has a value in itself and that we need to find a way in peace and harmony to achieve a balance between the need of each human being is a major step forward that presupposes a different way of consciousness.
And it's really fascinating because when I spoke with Eileen last week, and she was discussing some findings of Harvard Shine recently about, organizations in the face of COVID, if there's any silver lining to it, have really gotten on board with this concept of, taking stock of where they're at, and when it comes to, what you would describe as the organizational consciousness, and really, I think seeing the opportunity that companies and organizations and workplaces in general are providing for everyone as we navigate a new scenario and a new economic context with the pandemic. And I think it's becoming less of a difficult sell for leaders to consider the well-being of their employees and the individualization and agency of their people.
Yes, well, I believe what is wonderful with the research of Eileen is that she is able to document that shift in mindset from executive. So that will empower other executives to perceive that they are not alone. There's many other people having the same interest.
Right. Well, and I was listening to a conversation earlier today about, you know, in a way, this interplay between individuals and systems, I think, kind of plays itself out within our two-party political system as well in the country. And I think it's easy for the conversation to veer all the way to one side or the other, to the individual or to the system. And I was reminded by an education researcher coming out of Stanford that there's a lot in between that. There's a lot in between the individual and the system, and looking at, smaller groups or community level things, or even departmental nuances can be a way to kind of start to navigate this, what can seem like, really big task, and make it manageable, and make it agile and responsive to the needs of the time.
Yes, and the interesting piece of what you are mentioning is that traditionally, it looks like the solution is a silver bullet in some limit. In practice, as you just mentioned, most of the situation are um, with paradox, with polarities. And therefore, it's not a matter of just saying, I have the silver bullet, but is about managing polarities, is about managing apparently totally contradictory demands. And that means that is not black and white, is all kind of grays. And one of the challenge that we face as human being is that it's much easier to operate with black and white than grays.
It's interesting. I know Brene Brown recently had a conversation with Barack Obama, and she was talking about this very concept, and I've heard this concept come up in creativity research as well, of having this. I've heard creativity and creative people defined as people who can hold opposing viewpoints at the same time, and kind of allow them to, have that tension between them. And I think that, I don't know, if you're familiar with like dialectical thinking and dialectical frameworks, but I find that quite helpful when it comes to these paradoxes, right? Of, it can be extremely one way or extremely another. But I think, dialectical thinking allows you a range between them, and it helps you see the value of both, that you need both of those holding each post on each side, and the tension between them is where the really good stuff lives.
Yes, well, again, Fitzgerald is probably the first that speak about that. The intelligence is the capacity to have and manage two conflicting concepts and be still operational. So, in the fact is that today we are in an environment where when we want to conciliate diversity, it will not be the absolute solution, best solution for participants. So that in order to optimize a complex system, you will sub-optimize the parts. And that is a concept that for many people is difficult to accept because we have that sense that we need to have the optimum solution for each one. And in a complex system, by design, it's not easy to obtain that.
Well, and I think that there's a pervasive mindset around, um, even just tension in general. I think it goes back to what you were saying about, the healthcare system or the medical system being based on pathology. And I think there's this misperception of social tension as a completely bad thing, and something that is, and it is having a major impact psychologically and emotionally on people. But I think tension is where a lot of the solutions lie, and the more that we can kind of see the whole, right, see the tension between the two polarities. And I jokingly say that, not seeing the half full or half empty, but just seeing the glass and seeing the whole purpose of all of it, it allows you some freedom to play.
Yeah, I totally accept, and I love your way to framing it. The challenge is that most of the time, and again, I will not generalize uh, in excess, but many human beings do not see the glass, do not see the system. They only see their question. So they operate and create a tension as a result of only looking at one facet of a complex problem. And of course, they are creating demand without acknowledging the glass. They are creating demand only based on their view of one aspect of the level of water within the glass.
It's interesting. I love the way you put that about only focusing on the question, and all these different concepts kind of immediately came into my mind of spanning from confirmation bias and our natural tendencies to seek out information that basically proves what we already think, to this idea, even going back to Richard Dawkins about humans are inherently selfish creatures and will always think and act in a self-serving way. And I think that there are realities to a lot of those viewpoints and a lot of those kind of shortcuts that humans use to navigate our lives. But I also think that you know if we can zoom out and see the glass and know these things, and the findings coming out of behavioral economics are really helpful in that, of sometimes all it takes is having a name for this thing that we do, and then we can zoom out and see it, and then make a different choice, or find a different solution to a natural tendency of basic psychological nature.
Yes, now when you want to create those choice, you need to have a shared purpose. And most of the time, we are not speaking about what is the shared purpose of a community. We are speaking about what are the individual needs of the participant in that community. And trying to analyze those needs without having a clear understanding of the global purpose of the community doesn't work. Because in one point, you need to balance those needs of the different participants in the context of the best solution for the global purpose.
Mm. I that's a fundamental thing that you bring up, and I'm glad that you shed light on it too, because I think there's also a massive reality that, in a way, our world and our way of operating has gotten both much bigger and much smaller, right? Because bigger in the sense that my community where I live now is so intricately connected to various communities all across the world through supply chains, through communication platforms, through, even energy sources. But it also has gotten smaller in the exact same way, right? That all of these added players to a community's existence has, at least for a lot of people, I think, made the situation really hard to navigate and hard to figure out what's the direction forward. Who do I prioritize when I think about what actions I want to take? And I think this idea of shared value is a really great one to introduce to the conversation of how do we create that when the reality is that our communities have gotten much bigger, even if it's in an invisible way.
Yes, well, again, I totally accept again your position in terms of shared value, but the point is that for speaking about a shared value, you need to define the boundary of that community. Who is within that community? Because when you speak about shared value, you are speaking about a specific team of human beings. And the fact is that one of the challenges that you already mentioned is that our connectivity means that we participate within multiple communities without having a clear understanding of the boundaries of those different communities. So, in one point, we may operate from a very personal objective, trying to maximize some interest without realizing how we may impact positively or negatively those different communities.
Absolutely. And that's a great point. And I think, even and this came up in my conversation with Eileen too. This idea of space and place has gotten so abstract in the world we live in. Because I mean, right now, you and I are in two different states, and we're separated by time zones, and we're able to have a real time conversation about things with global implications. And so, how do you put a boundary around this idea of space and place that has gotten so abstract and so nebulous in a lot of ways?
Well, it's very abstract, very nebulous, or very concrete and very specific. All depends you're choosing. Uh, because first, when we are speaking about place, most of the time is a geographic reference. When we are speaking about a space, we are speaking about a concept. So, in the context of a concept, we may share the same space, only not being in the same place. And the beauty of having the possibility of creating communities in space is that we are having that connectivity, although we are not in the same place. So now we are creating a community based on shared values, based on shared aspirations. And that is completely different than the place where we are constrained, physically speaking, in an environment that may, in some limit, impose value, may impose constraint, may impose a style of government.
Right. Well, and I think this is where, kind of tipping back toward the individual becomes helpful, right? Because, in the face of these ethereal notions of space and the confines of my geographical place, I as a person have to figure out how to live my life and how to do my day. And, I think understanding um, my agency and the things that I need as an individual to thrive, things like access to flow states, things like access to learning, connection, social connection, things like that, help me make those determinations of value as I navigate these different spaces within which I move, right? So whether that my professional spaces of, that are scattered across the country and across the globe, actually, navigating those and kind of in context, taking that notion of shared value in real time and within the specific confines and contexts that they appear.
Yes. And again, you need an incredible courage to be who you want to be. Because at the same time that you manifest who you want to be, and as you mentioned before, in order to thrive, uh, you also create vulnerability. And is that willingness to be who you want to be that enable you to flourish if the environment allows you to do that. And not all environment will allows you to do that.
Yeah. Well, and this is always something that I enjoy so much whenever I speak with you because you have this wonderful way of always keeping the human element in mind and this idea of, these ideas of courage and grace and vulnerability that I think are these really deeply felt concepts. They're not intellectual concepts, but they're a deep part of being human. Um, I think are shied away from a lot in conversations like this. And what does it mean to have courage? And what does it mean to have grace? And what does that mean at a group level versus an individual level? I think is a really important part of the conversation because it keeps us anchored in, in a kind of shared value.
Yes, I totally accept.
Francois, what, looking at the state of the world right now and the state of work, the state of governments, what are you looking forward to? What gives you inspiration or hope that you've been reading lately or that you've been thinking about in response to the time in which we live?
Well, for me, what is an inspiration is the work that Eileen and you are doing. So for me, that is a major inspiration because I'm very, very confident that the future for us, if we want to make an impact for the benefit of humanity, is in creating a better awareness about the need for systemic thinking, about the need for accepting that we as individual by design we will be sub-optimized uh, because again that is a demand for humility and the fact that understanding that we have good intention but we need to manifest those good intention in a context of multiple constraints and that therefore although we may have good intention we may not consistently achieve what we want.
Right. I find in my own, and thank you for saying that, by the way. And I've been continually inspired by your support of this work and your constant dialogue about human well-being and flourishing as well. And I think in my own personal life, I've seen a number of people getting very clear about what they want to leave out in the world, about how they want to show up in society and how they want to show up in their careers and in their families. And it's really fascinating. And again, I speak from only my own personal experience, but it's fascinating to see people wrestling with these big questions. And I think I've seen people wrestling with the big questions more than at any point in my life. And I'm really curious to see 10 years from now the lasting effects, both positive and negative, but I'm hopeful about the way the world is responding to the moment we're in.
I have a major hope. I'm confident. Now, I'm not saying that we will not go to a significant crisis, because obviously we have that crisis right now at the geopolitical, economic, healthcare. So there's no doubt about the crisis. But I'm very confident that we will thrive when we break through that crisis.
Yeah. And I think, the communications aspect of this has made it very difficult, and easier actually in some ways, to not look our situation in the eye and to not, it's made hard to overlook some of the things that were hidden in plain sight for different groups of people. And I think now, with that, however, it has become quite easy to simply seek out only the information that aligns with your own views. And I think content creators like myself and researchers like Eileen and, brilliant thinkers like yourself are really putting those systems into check and under scrutiny and figuring out how to look it in the eye and then figure out what we're going to do forward or moving forward in order to create a different reality.
I accept. I totally accept.
Well, Francois, thank you so much for your time. I was so excited. We've been planning this for a couple weeks now, and knowing that I would get to see you again and speak to you about the things that I know make us both so excited and so passionate was, it's just a joy to speak with you as always.
Oh, I enjoy it. Thank you very much.